The stagecoach wheels had stopped turning an hour ago, but Sarah Mitchell could still hear them echoing in her mind as she stumbled through the Colorado wilderness. Her white wedding dress, once pristine for a ceremony that would never happen, now caught on every pine branch and bramble. Blood trickled from scratches on her arms, and her delicate silk shoes were no match for the Rocky Mountain terrain. Behind her, smoke still rose from where the coach had crashed after the wheel gave way on Blue Mountain Pass. The driver was dead. The horses had bolted. And somewhere in these unforgiving mountains, a man she'd never met was waiting for a bride who would never arrive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. James Carter stood on his ranch porch that same evening, watching the sunset paint Pine Ridge Valley in shades of gold and crimson. The silence that surrounded his isolated homestead felt heavier tonight, pressing against him like a physical weight. For 34 years, he'd lived alone on this mountain, building something substantial from nothing but determination and sweat. His cattle grazed in the lower pastures, his cabin stood solid against the elements, and his name was respected from Millfield to Denver. Yet as he looked out over the empire he'd carved from wilderness, one thought consumed him. All of it meant nothing without someone to share it with. The marriage arrangement had been practical, nothing more. Sarah Mitchell from Boston, a woman of education and refinement who needed security, and James Carter, a successful rancher who needed a wife. They'd exchanged letters for 6 months, formal correspondence that revealed little of either person's true nature. She would bring civilization to his rough mountain life. He would provide the safety and stability her circumstances required. It was a business transaction dressed up in wedding clothes, and both parties understood the terms. Or so he'd thought. Sarah had been walking for 3 hours when she saw the light. A warm yellow glow emanated from windows that seemed impossibly far away across a meadow dotted with cattle. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, and the mountain cold was seeping through her torn dress. Every step sent sharp pains through her feet, but that distant light represented hope in a landscape that had offered nothing but danger since the crash. She pressed forward, using fence posts to steady herself as she crossed the pasture, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. James was splitting wood for the night when he heard footsteps on his porch. Visitors were rare this far up the mountain, especially after dark. He set down his axe and moved toward the door, his hand instinctively checking the revolver at his hip. Mountain life had taught him caution, but when he opened the door, nothing could have prepared him for what he found. A woman stood swaying on his threshold, her face pale with exhaustion and streaked with dirt and tears. Her wedding dress hung in tatters, and her dark hair had escaped its careful arrangement to fall in tangles around her shoulders. "Please," she whispered, and then her knees buckled. James caught her before she hit the wooden planks, lifting her easily in his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, fragile in a way that made something protective stir in his chest. He carried her inside, settling her in the chair closest to the fireplace before adding wood to coax the flames higher. In the warm light, he could see the extent of her ordeal. Scratches covered her arms and face, her shoes were ruined, and her dress was torn in a dozen places. But even disheveled and exhausted, there was something striking about her, an inner strength that showed through the vulnerability. "Ma'am, can you tell me what happened?" James asked, keeping his voice gentle as he brought her a cup of water from the kitchen pump. Sarah's hands shook as she accepted the cup, drinking deeply before attempting to speak. "The stagecoach crashed on the pass. The wheel came off, and we went over the side. Mr. Henderson, the driver." Her voice broke, and she couldn't finish the sentence. James felt ice form in his stomach. He knew that stretch of road, knew how treacherous it became when coaches traveled too fast or carried too much weight. Many travelers had met their end on those switchbacks over the years. "You walked here from Blue Mountain Pass?" The disbelief in his voice was evident. That was nearly 10 miles of rough terrain in the dark, wearing nothing but a wedding dress and silk shoes. "I had nowhere else to go," Sarah said simply. "I was supposed to meet my—" She paused, studying his face in the firelight. Something about his weathered features seemed familiar, though she was certain they'd never met. "Were you expecting someone tonight?" The realization hit James like a physical blow. The timing, the wedding dress, the fact that she'd been traveling this remote route. There could be only one explanation. "You're Sarah Mitchell," he said, and it wasn't a question. Sarah's eyes widened as she took in the implications. This mountain man, with his rough clothes and calloused hands, was James Carter, the man she was supposed to marry. The man whose letters had been so carefully formal, revealing nothing of the quiet strength she could see in his steady gaze. "You're James," she whispered. An awkward silence settled between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Both had imagined this meeting countless times during their months of correspondence, but neither had envisioned it happening under these circumstances. Sarah pulled the tattered remains of her wedding dress closer around her shoulders, suddenly aware of how she must look. James stood uncertainly by the mantel, unsure whether to offer comfort to an injured stranger or maintain the formal distance appropriate for a woman he barely knew but had planned to marry. "I should tend to those cuts," James finally said, moving toward a cabinet where he kept medical supplies. Mountain living had taught him basic wound care, and some of the scratches on her arms looked deep enough to need attention. "That's very kind, but I can manage," Sarah replied, though she made no move to refuse his help. The truth was, she felt overwhelmed by everything that had happened. The crash, the long walk through dangerous terrain, the discovery that she'd somehow found her intended husband's ranch in the darkness. It seemed impossible that so much could change in a single day. James returned with a basin of warm water and clean cloth, setting them on the table beside her chair. "May I?" he asked, and Sarah nodded, extending her arm. His touch was gentle despite his rough hands, carefully cleaning the scratches and applying salve with practiced efficiency. As he worked, Sarah studied his profile, noting the concentration in his eyes and the careful way he handled her injuries. "You're not what I expected," she said quietly. James glanced up from bandaging a particularly deep scratch. "What did you expect?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah considered the question. His letters had been polite but distant, revealing little personality. She'd imagined someone cold, perhaps harsh, a man seeking a wife for purely practical reasons with little regard for her feelings or comfort. Instead, she found herself in the care of someone who showed genuine concern for her well-being, who treated her injuries with the kind of attention one might give to something precious rather than merely useful. "I don't know," she admitted. "Someone more." She gestured vaguely, unable to find words that wouldn't sound insulting. "Rough around the edges?" James suggested with a slight smile that transformed his entire face. "Well, you're not wrong about that. Mountain living doesn't exactly polish a man's social graces." Despite everything that had happened, Sarah found herself smiling back. "I meant someone less kind. Your letters were very proper, but they didn't mention that you were." She paused, realizing she was about to say something far too personal for their circumstances. "That I was what?" James prompted, finishing with her bandages and settling back in his own chair. "Gentle," Sarah finished quietly. "I've known many proper gentlemen in Boston society, but very few gentle ones." James felt something shift in his chest at her words. In the months since arranging this marriage, he'd wondered constantly whether a refined Eastern woman could ever be happy in his simple mountain life. Her letters had been educated and articulate, full of references to books and cultural events that were foreign to his experience. He'd assumed she would find him lacking in sophistication, perhaps even crude. The idea that she might see gentleness in him rather than roughness was both surprising and deeply moving. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I want you to know that what happened tonight changes things. The arrangement we made was based on different circumstances. You've been through a terrible ordeal, and you're in no condition to make decisions about marriage or anything else. You can stay here as long as you need to recover, and when you're ready, I'll arrange safe passage to wherever you want to go. There's no obligation between us now." Sarah stared into the fire, considering his words. The crash had indeed changed everything. The life she'd been fleeing in Boston seemed very far away now, and the carefully planned future she'd accepted, out of necessity, had been shattered along with the stagecoach wheel. But sitting in this warm cabin, tended to by a man who asked nothing of her except to let him help, she wasn't sure she wanted to leave. "What if I don't know where I want to go?" she asked. James studied her face in the firelight, seeing something he hadn't expected in her expression. Not the resignation he'd detected in her letters, but a kind of quiet curiosity. "Then you can stay until you figure it out," he said simply. Outside, the mountain wind picked up, howling around the cabin and rattling the windows. Sarah pulled the blanket James had given her closer around her shoulders, grateful for the warmth and safety of his home. Tomorrow would bring decisions and complications, but tonight she was simply alive, sitting by a fire with a man who had shown her more genuine kindness in a few hours than she'd experienced in months of Boston society. "James," she said softly, "what made you decide to send for a wife? If you don't mind me asking." James poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks up the chimney. It was a question he'd avoided examining too closely, even in his own mind. "Loneliness, I suppose," he admitted. "This ranch, everything I've built here, it feels empty without someone to share it with. I used to think that was foolish, that a man should be content with his work and his land. But the older I get, the more I realize that all the success in the world doesn't mean much if you have no one to come home to." His honesty surprised Sarah. The men she'd known in Boston rarely spoke so directly about their feelings, preferring to hide vulnerability behind social conventions and witty conversation. "And why a mail-order arrangement rather than the conventional way?" "Look around," James said with a slight laugh. "There aren't exactly many eligible women in Pine Ridge Valley. The nearest town is Millfield, population maybe 400 on a good day. Most of the unmarried women there are either spoken for or—" He paused diplomatically. "Not the type you'd want to marry," Sarah finished with understanding. "Something like that. And even if there were suitable candidates, I'm not exactly a charming socialite. I can run a ranch, handle difficult cattle, survive mountain winters, but I never learned the art of courtship. A business arrangement seemed more honest." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Her own reasons for accepting the arrangement had been equally practical, though born of desperation rather than loneliness. Her father's death had left her with debts and no means of supporting herself. Marriage to a stranger in Colorado had seemed preferable to becoming dependent on relatives who had made their disapproval of her independent spirit very clear. "I suppose honesty is refreshing," she said. "Though I admit, sitting here now, the whole thing seems rather cold in retrospect." "Does it?" James asked, genuinely curious. "How so?" Sarah hesitated, then decided to match his honesty with her own. "In Boston, I was surrounded by people who said all the right things, who followed all the proper forms, but very few of them actually cared about my well-being. Tonight, you've shown me more genuine consideration than I received from men who claim to be my friends. It makes me wonder if we had the arrangement backwards. Perhaps kindness matters more than social compatibility." James felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the fire. Her words touched something deep in his chest, a hope he'd been afraid to acknowledge. The woman sitting across from him was nothing like the polite stranger he'd expected from their correspondence. There was depth to her, a willingness to see beyond surface appearances that intrigued him. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Are you running from something in Boston? Or someone?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah's hands tightened on the blanket, and for a moment James thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Both," she admitted. "My father left debts when he died. Substantial ones. There were men who claimed he owed them money, and they were becoming insistent about collecting what they felt was owed. My aunt suggested that marriage to a Westerner might provide the distance and protection I needed." James nodded slowly, understanding more than she'd actually said. Boston's business world could be ruthless, especially toward lone women with no male relatives to protect them. The idea that someone had been threatening her filled him with a protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. "You're safe here," he said firmly. "Whatever those debts were, whatever those men claimed, they have no power in Colorado territory. And even if they did, they'd have to go through me to reach you." Something in his tone, a quiet certainty that spoke of both capability and determination, made Sarah believe him completely. For the first time in months, she felt truly safe. Not just physically protected, but emotionally secure in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible. "Thank you," she said simply, but the words carried more weight than their brevity suggested. As the fire burned lower, they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in thought about how dramatically their lives had changed in a single evening. The marriage arrangement that had brought them together was no longer relevant, but something else was taking its place, a connection based on genuine human understanding rather than practical necessity. James, Sarah said eventually, would you tell me about this place? About your life here? His face lit up with enthusiasm, and for the next hour he shared stories of building the ranch from nothing, of harsh winters and abundant summers, of the satisfaction that came from creating something lasting with your own hands. Sarah listened with growing fascination, hearing in his words a passion and purpose that was utterly different from the aimless social whirl she'd known in Boston. As the night grew late and the fire burned to embers, James showed Sarah to the spare room he'd prepared months ago for his expected bride. It was simple but comfortable, with a solid bed and clean linens, a wash basin and mirror, and windows that would show the mountain vista in the morning light. "Sleep as long as you need," he said from the doorway. "Tomorrow we can figure out what comes next." But as Sarah settled into the unfamiliar bed, listening to the mountain wind and the distant sound of James banking the fire in the main room, she was beginning to think she already knew what came next. The crash had destroyed her carefully laid plans, but perhaps it had also opened the door to something far better than anything she could have arranged. Outside, snow began to fall softly on Pine Ridge Valley, covering the harsh landscape in gentle white. Inside the cabin, two people who had expected to meet as strangers fulfilling a contract instead found themselves drawn together by forces neither had anticipated. The mountain man who had sought companionship and the lost bride who had needed sanctuary were discovering that sometimes the best arrangements are the ones that right themselves. Dawn arrived with crystalline clarity across Pine Ridge Valley, the morning sun casting long shadows through the pine trees and turning the fresh snow into diamonds scattered across the meadow. Sarah woke to unfamiliar sounds, the lowing of cattle. In the distance, the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood, and the whistle of wind through mountain peaks. For a moment, disorientation clouded her thoughts before the events of the previous night came flooding back. The crash, the desperate walk through darkness, and most surprisingly, the gentle kindness of James Carter. She rose carefully, testing her injured feet against the cold wooden floor. Through the window, she could see James working near the barn, his movements efficient and purposeful as he loaded hay onto a wagon. Even from this distance, she could sense the quiet competence that seemed to define everything about him. He worked without wasted motion, each task flowing naturally into the next, and she found herself watching longer than propriety suggested. A soft knock interrupted her observations. "Sarah?" James's voice carried through the door, respectful, but concerned. "I've left some clothes outside your door. They belonged to my sister when she visited last spring. They might fit better then." He paused diplomatically. Sarah looked down at her torn wedding dress, remembering how foolish she must have appeared stumbling onto his porch in such finery. "Thank you," she called back. "That's very thoughtful." The clothes proved to be a simple brown wool dress, sturdy boots, and a warm shawl. They were practical garments, designed for mountain life rather than Boston drawing rooms, but they fit reasonably well and felt infinitely more appropriate than silk and lace in this rugged environment. As she dressed, Sarah caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. The refined lady who had boarded the stagecoach in Denver seemed like a stranger now. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders instead of being pinned into elaborate arrangements, and the simple clothes revealed a more natural version of herself. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found James standing by the stove, stirring something that smelled wonderfully of bacon and fresh bread. He turned at her approach, and she saw approval in his eyes as he took in her transformed appearance. "Much more practical," he said with a slight smile. "Though I have to say you look more yourself in those clothes than you did in all that finery." "How would you know what I look like when I'm myself?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. "We've only just met." James paused in his stirring, considering her question. "I suppose I mean you look more comfortable. Less like you're wearing a costume." He ladled eggs and bacon onto a plate, adding a thick slice of bread still warm from the oven. "Mountain life has a way of stripping away pretense. What you see is generally what you get." Sarah accepted the plate gratefully, realizing she hadn't eaten since early the previous morning. The food was simple but perfectly prepared, and she found herself eating with more appetite than she'd had in months. In Boston, pretense is practically an art form, she said between bites. Sometimes I think people forget who they really are underneath all the social expectations. And who are you? James asked, settling across from her with his own breakfast. Underneath all those expectations? It was a question Sarah had been asking herself more frequently in recent months, especially as her circumstances had grown increasingly desperate. I'm not entirely sure, she admitted. In Boston, I was known as Charles Mitchell's daughter, then as an eligible young woman of good breeding but unfortunate finances. I was expected to be accomplished but not too intelligent, charming but not too spirited, educated but never scholarly. It's exhausting, constantly adjusting yourself to fit what others expect. James nodded thoughtfully. Out here, you're judged more by what you do than who your father was or how much money you have. It can be liberating, though I suppose it takes some getting used to. What do you do when you're not ranching? Sarah asked, curious about this man who seemed so different from anyone she'd known. Read, mostly. I know that probably surprises you, given. He gestured to his rough appearance and simple surroundings. Why would that surprise me? Most people assume that mountain men are illiterate. I've had visitors express shock that I own books, let alone read them. There was a hint of old frustration in his voice, suggesting this was a prejudice he'd encountered often. Sarah looked around the cabin with new eyes, noticing details she'd missed in the previous night's exhaustion and firelight. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on everything from agricultural techniques to philosophy. A writing desk sat near the window, with papers neatly arranged and ink still wet in the well. This wasn't the home of an uneducated frontiersman, but of a thoughtful man who'd chosen isolation without abandoning intellectual pursuits. I made assumptions too, she admitted. Your letters were well written, but I thought perhaps you'd had help composing them. I'm beginning to realize I was wrong about many things. Before James could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they could see 3 riders making their way up the valley trail, moving with the purposeful pace of men on official business. James's expression darkened as he recognized the lead rider. Frank Sullivan, he said grimly, rising from the table. And it looks like he's brought Sheriff Morrison with him. He turned to Sarah with concern evident in his eyes. You might want to stay inside for this. Sullivan isn't known for his manners around women. But Sarah had already moved to the window, her curiosity overcoming caution. The lead rider was a large man with an expensive hat and coat that marked him as someone of substance in the community. The sheriff rode slightly behind, his badge catching the morning light, while the third man appeared to be a hired hand of some sort. All 3 carried themselves with the confidence of men accustomed to getting their way. What does Sullivan want with you? Sarah asked. My land, James replied bluntly, checking his gun belt with the unconscious efficiency of someone who'd faced trouble before. He's been trying to buy me out for 2 years. My ranch sits right in the middle of what he considers his territory, and it galls him that I won't sell. The riders pulled up in front of the cabin, and Sullivan dismounted with the swagger of a man who owned half the county. He was younger than James, perhaps 40, with the soft look of someone who'd grown prosperous without ever doing physical labor. His clothes were expensive but ostentatious, designed to impress rather than function. Carter, Sullivan called out without dismounting. We need to talk. James stepped onto the porch, his hand resting casually near his revolver. Sullivan, Sheriff Morrison. Bit early for a social call, isn't it? Sullivan's eyes swept over the cabin, taking in details with the calculating gaze of a man assessing property values. Heard you had some excitement up here last night. Stagecoach crashed on the pass. News travels fast, James replied neutrally. It does when there's a passenger missing. Sheriff Morrison interjected, finally speaking up. He was a thin man, with nervous eyes who clearly took his cues from Sullivan rather than the law. Young woman named Sarah Mitchell. She was supposed to arrive in Millfield yesterday. James felt Sarah's presence behind the window and hoped she had the sense to stay hidden. Haven't seen any passengers from a crashed coach, he said truthfully. He hadn't seen any passengers. He'd seen Sarah, but she'd arrived on her own too, feet long after becoming separated from the wreckage. Sullivan smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. That's interesting. Carter, Because her baggage was found scattered along the trail leading directly to your ranch. Seems like she might have wandered this way looking for help. Could be, James acknowledged. This is the only inhabited place. For miles in that direction. If someone was lost up there, they might head toward my lights. So you won't mind if we take a look around, Sheriff Morrison said, though it was clearly a statement rather than a request. Make sure this young lady isn't in need of assistance. James stepped forward slightly, his body language subtly shifting to something more protective. Actually, I do mind. This is private property, and you have no warrant. If you want to search my land, you'll need proper legal authority. Sullivan's face darkened. You're being awfully protective of your privacy, Carter. Makes a man wonder what you might be hiding up here. I'm protecting my rights, James replied calmly. Same as any law-abiding citizen would do. The tension in the air was palpable. Sarah, watching from behind the curtain, could see the way the three men had positioned themselves to surround James, could sense the barely controlled aggression in Sullivan's posture. Whatever this was about, it went far beyond concern for a missing passenger. Tell you what, Carter, Sullivan said, his voice taking on a false jovial tone. I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to make you another offer for this place. Double what I offered last time. That's more than generous for a spread this remote. And I'll give you the same answer I gave last time, James replied. Not interested. That's short-sighted of you, Sullivan continued. Way I hear it, you're planning to start a family soon. Got yourself a mail-order bride coming in from back east. Man with family responsibilities needs to think about security, about having neighbors who can help out in times of trouble. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. James felt his temper rise, but he kept his voice level. I appreciate your concern for my future welfare, Sullivan, but I can take care of myself and anyone under my protection. Can you? Sullivan asked, his mask of friendliness dropping entirely. Because accidents happen out here, Carter. Harsh winters, dangerous animals, equipment failures. A man living alone is vulnerable in ways he might not even realize. Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly recognizing that Sullivan was moving beyond subtle intimidation into open threats. Maybe we should just file a report about the missing woman and let the territorial authorities handle it, he suggested weakly. Good idea, Sullivan agreed, though his eyes never left James. Territorial marshal might want to conduct a thorough investigation. Question all the local residents, search all the properties. That could take weeks, maybe months. Lot of disruption for the community. James understood the subtext perfectly. Sullivan had enough influence to ensure that any investigation would be drawn out and intrusive, designed to make life difficult for anyone who opposed him. It was a classic intimidation tactic, using the law as a weapon while maintaining plausible deniability. You do what you think is right, Sheriff, James said quietly. I'll cooperate with any legitimate investigation. Sullivan remounted his horse with obvious frustration. He'd expected either compliance or an angry outburst that would give him excuse to escalate the confrontation. James's calm refusal to be baited had denied him both options. This isn't over, Carter, Sullivan said as he wheeled his horse around. A man who won't be reasonable about business eventually finds that business becomes very unreasonable with him. The three riders departed as suddenly as they'd arrived, leaving James standing on his porch with his jaw clenched and his hand still resting near his gun. Sarah emerged from the cabin, her face pale but determined. He knows I'm here, she said without preamble. James turned to face her, seeing the fear she was trying to hide beneath a facade of calm. Maybe he's just fishing, hoping to pressure me into making a mistake. What does he really want? Sarah asked. It can't just be your ranch. There's plenty of land in Colorado territory. James walked to the porch railing, looking out over the valley that had become his life's work. Water rights, he said finally. My land controls the headwaters of Silver Creek, which feeds half the valley. Sullivan's been buying up ranches downstream, but without access to the source, his empire has limits. Control my water, and he controls every rancher from here to Millfield. Sarah joined him at the railing, beginning to understand the scope of what they were facing. And my presence here gives him leverage. He can claim you're harboring a missing person, bring in territorial authorities, make life difficult until you capitulate. Something like that, James agreed. Though I suspect his plans go deeper than simple business pressure. What do you mean? James hesitated, then decided she deserved to know the full truth of what she'd walked into. Frank Sullivan doesn't just want my land. He wants to control this entire valley, and that means eliminating anyone who might oppose him. Small ranchers, independent businessmen, anyone who can't be bought or intimidated. He's been working on it for years, using a combination of legal pressure, economic warfare, and occasional violence. Violence. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. Accidents, James said grimly. Barn fires, cattle poisoning, equipment sabotage. Nothing that can be directly traced back to him, but enough to convince people that opposition isn't worth the risk. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She'd fled Boston to escape dangerous men who wanted to collect her father's debts, only to find herself in the middle of an even more serious conflict. Perhaps I should leave, she said quietly. Find another way to Denver. Take the train back east. I don't want to bring more trouble to your door. James turned to face her fully, his expression intense. Where would you go? Back to Boston. To the men who were threatening you? You said yourself you have no family willing to help. I could find work somewhere. I'm educated, I could teach or work as a governess. With no references, no connections, no money? James shook his head. You'd be alone and vulnerable. Exactly the kind of person men like Sullivan prey on. Sarah knew he was right, but the alternative seemed equally dangerous. Then what do you suggest? We stick to the original plan, James said firmly. You're here because we have a marriage arrangement. That makes you my responsibility and gives you legal protection under territorial law. Sullivan can suspect whatever he wants, but he can't prove anything improper happened. But we barely know each other, Sarah protested. Marriage is supposed to be. Supposed to be what? James interrupted gently. A love match? A social alliance? A business arrangement? We've both seen how well all those traditional approaches work out. He gestured toward the valley spread out before them. This is a hard land, Sarah. It demands honesty from the people who live here. Maybe that's not such a bad foundation for a marriage. Sarah stared out at the mountains, their peaks touched with snow and morning light. Everything about this place challenged her assumptions about what life should be. The quiet, the isolation, the sense that every decision carried real consequences, rather than just social implications. And the man standing beside her challenged her assumptions about what kind of person she wanted to become. What would you expect from such a marriage? She asked carefully. Partnership, James replied without hesitation. Someone who could work alongside me to build something lasting. Someone who could handle the isolation without losing their mind. Someone who could hold their own in difficult situations. He paused, studying her face. Someone who could walk 10 miles through mountain wilderness in a torn wedding dress and still have the strength to worry about bringing trouble to a stranger's door. Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling. That's quite a list of qualifications. You've already proven you meet them, James said simply. The sound of horses approaching again made them both tense, but this time it was a single rider coming up the valley trail at a leisurely pace. As the figure drew closer, James relaxed slightly. Doc Williams, he said with relief. Henry's the closest thing we have to law and order around here that isn't in Sullivan's pocket. Dr. Henry Williams was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of steady competence that came from years of dealing with frontier medical emergencies. He rode well despite his age, and his weathered face spoke of someone who'd seen enough of life to take most things in stride. Morning, James, Doc Williams called out as he approached. Heard there was some trouble on the pass last night. Doc, James replied with genuine warmth. Sarah, this is Dr. Henry Williams. Doc, I'd like you to meet Sarah Mitchell. Sarah stepped forward, noting the keen intelligence in the doctor's eyes as he assessed her appearance and the situation. Miss Mitchell, he said politely, touching the brim of his hat. I trust you weren't injured in the coach accident. Nothing serious, Sarah replied. Mr. Carter has been very kind. Doc Williams dismounted and tied his horse to the porch. Rail with practiced efficiency. Mind if I take a look anyway? Coach accidents can cause injuries that don't show up immediately. As the doctor examined her scratches and checked for signs of more serious trauma, Sarah found herself appreciating his professional manner. Unlike Sheriff Morrison's nervous deference to Sullivan, Doc Williams carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who answered to his own conscience rather than political pressure. You're lucky, he said finally, packing his medical bag. Could have been much worse. Mountain passes are dangerous enough in good weather. He glanced meaningfully at James. I suppose you'll be wanting to notify the territorial authorities about the accident. Already been taken care of, James replied. Sheriff Morrison was here earlier with Frank Sullivan. They're filing a report. Doc Williams's expression darkened slightly. Sullivan was here? That's interesting. Most men would send the sheriff alone on official business. Most men don't see every crisis as a business opportunity, James said dryly. The doctor nodded thoughtfully. James, could I speak with you privately for a moment? The two men walked toward the barn, leaving Sarah on the porch. She could see them talking earnestly, Doc Williams gesturing occasionally in the direction Sullivan's party had taken. When they returned, both men looked troubled. Miss Mitchell, Doc Williams said carefully, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Are you here of your own free will? Sarah blinked in surprise. Of course. Why would you ask that? Because Frank Sullivan has been spreading word in town that James might be holding you against your will. He's claiming that the marriage arrangement gives James legal cover to keep you isolated up here, away from proper authorities. Sarah felt anger flare in her chest. That's ridiculous. Mr. Carter has been nothing but honorable. He's offered to help me leave if that's what I want. I believe you, Doc Williams said gently. But perception matters in a small community. Sullivan has influence, and he's very good at making his version of events sound plausible. James's jaw tightened. What's he really after, Doc? Same thing he's always after. Your land, your water rights, and the elimination of anyone who might stand in his way. But now he's got a new angle. He's claiming that harboring a woman under questionable circumstances shows you're not the upstanding citizen you pretend to be. Sarah felt the weight of the situation settling around her like a trap. Every option seemed to lead to more complications, more danger for both herself and James. What can we do? Doc Williams smiled for the first time since arriving. Actually, that part's simple. You get married, officially and publicly, with witnesses who can testify that it was entirely voluntary. That removes any question about the propriety of your living arrangements and establishes your legal rights as James's wife. Today, Sarah asked, feeling overwhelmed by how quickly events were moving. Today, Doc Williams confirmed. I can perform the ceremony myself. I'm authorized to conduct marriages under territorial law. We'll need at least 2 witnesses, but I can ask Mary Lou Jenkins and old Pete McCormick to ride up from town. James turned to Sarah, his expression serious but kind. It's your choice, he said quietly. I won't pressure you either way. But if you're willing, it might be the best protection for both of us. Sarah looked around the valley, taking in the mountains and meadows, the solid cabin and well-tended ranch, the quiet strength of the man offering her not just marriage but genuine partnership. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but then again, her plans had been made from desperation rather than hope. Yes, she said firmly. Let's do it. Mary Lou Jenkins arrived at the Carter Ranch 3 hours later, her weathered hands clutching a bundle of wildflowers she'd gathered along the trail. The proprietor of the Silver Dollar Saloon was a woman of 55 with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen enough of frontier life to judge character quickly. She'd known James since he first settled in Pine Ridge Valley, and her presence at the hastily arranged ceremony carried significant weight in the community. James Carter, she said, dismounting from her horse with the grace of someone who'd been riding mountain trails for decades. Doc Williams tells me you're finally taking a wife. About time, I'd say. Her keen gaze turned to Sarah, taking in everything from her simple dress to the way she stood close to James without seeming to cling. And you must be the infamous Sarah Mitchell. Half the town's been buzzing about you since dawn. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, wondering what exactly the town had been saying. I hope the talk hasn't been too scandalous, Mrs. Jenkins. Call me Mary Lou, dear. And scandal's a relative thing in a place like Millfield. Folks are more concerned with character than circumstances. She handed the wildflowers to Sarah with a smile. These aren't much, but a bride ought to have flowers on her wedding day, even if it's not the wedding she originally planned. The bouquet was simple but lovely, mountain lupin and Indian paintbrush bound together with a strip of blue ribbon. Sarah found herself unexpectedly moved by the gesture, a kindness from a woman who barely knew her but had chosen to support her nonetheless. Old Pete McCormick arrived shortly after, his ancient bay horse picking its way carefully up the rocky trail. Pete was one of the original settlers in the valley, a man whose stories reached back to the days when this was still disputed territory between the Ute and the U.S. government. His ranch bordered James's to the south, and the two men had developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared challenges. "Heard you were having yourself a wedding," Pete called out, his voice carrying the rasp of too many years breathing mountain air and tobacco smoke. "Figured I ought to witness it, seeing as how we're neighbors and all." He studied Sarah with faded blue eyes that still held sharp intelligence. "Young lady, you know what you're getting into? Marrying a stubborn cuss like James." "I'm beginning to understand," Sarah replied, surprised to find herself relaxing under the old man's direct gaze. There was something refreshing about these mountain people and their straightforward manner of speaking. "Good," Pete nodded approvingly. "Marriage is hard enough when both parties know what they're signing up for. When one of them's fooling themselves, it's bound to end in heartbreak." Doc Williams emerged from the cabin carrying a worn leather Bible and a sheet of paper that would serve as the marriage certificate. "If everyone's ready, I think we should proceed. I'd like to have this done before Sullivan decides to pay another visit." The ceremony took place on the porch, with Pine Ridge Valley spread out below them like a congregation of mountains and meadows. Doc Williams positioned himself between James and Sarah, while Mary Lou and Pete flanked them as witnesses. The afternoon sun cast everything in golden light, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. "Marriage," Doc Williams began, his voice taking on the formal cadence he used for official occasions, "is not just a union between two people, but a partnership that affects the entire community. In frontier life, we depend on each other for survival, and a strong marriage creates a foundation that benefits everyone." Sarah listened to the words, struck by how different this ceremony was from the elaborate church weddings she'd witnessed. In Boston, there were no orchestral accompaniments, no crowds of fashionable guests, no lengthy speeches about social connections and family alliances. Instead, there was honesty, simplicity, and a sense that the vows being exchanged would be tested by real challenges rather than social inconveniences. "James Carter," Doc Williams continued, "do you take Sarah Mitchell to be your wife, to love and protect her, to share with her both the joys and hardships of life in this valley, to be her partner in all things as long as you both shall live?" James turned to face Sarah fully, his gray eyes serious but warm. "I do," he said quietly, and something in his tone suggested he understood the full weight of what he was promising. "Sarah Mitchell," Doc Williams said, "do you take James Carter to be your husband, to stand with him through whatever challenges may come, to build a life together based on mutual respect and shared purpose, to be his partner in all things as long as you both shall live?" Sarah looked into James's weathered face, seeing strength and kindness in equal measure. 24 hours ago, she'd been a desperate woman fleeing an impossible situation. Now she stood on a mountain porch, about to marry a man she barely knew but already trusted more than most people she'd known for years. "I do," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was accepting. Doc Williams smiled, closing the Bible with a gentle thump. "Then by the authority vested in me by Colorado territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. James, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was brief and chaste, appropriate for a public ceremony with witnesses, but Sarah felt something spark between them that went beyond mere propriety. When they separated, she saw surprise in James's eyes that mirrored her own feelings. Whatever had just happened between them was more than either had expected. Mary Lou stepped forward with tears in her eyes, embracing Sarah warmly. "Welcome to the family, dear. And welcome to Pine Ridge Valley. It's a hard place, but it grows on you." Pete shook James's hand with the vigor of a man half his age. "About time you settled down, son. This place needs more good families if it's going to survive what's coming." "What's coming?" Sarah asked, picking up on the ominous undertone in the old man's words. Pete exchanged glances with Doc Williams, and both men looked troubled. "Change," Pete said finally. "The railroad's coming through in the next year or two, and that always brings complications. Men like Sullivan see it as an opportunity to get rich quick, regardless of who gets hurt in the process." Doc Williams nodded gravely. "Pete's right. Sullivan's been positioning himself to control as much land as possible before the railroad arrives. Your ranch, James, sits right where he wants to build a depot and cattle loading facility. That makes you more than just an inconvenience to his plans. James felt Sarah's hand slip into his, her fingers intertwining with his own. The gesture was small but significant, a sign that she was choosing to stand with him regardless of the dangers ahead. Then I guess it's a good thing I won't be facing those complications alone anymore, he said. Mary Lou insisted on preparing a proper wedding feast from the supplies she'd brought in her saddlebags, bustling around James's kitchen with the efficiency of someone accustomed to feeding large groups on short notice. Soon the cabin filled with the aromas of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and apple pie made with preserves from her own cellar. As they sat around the simple wooden table, Sarah found herself part of something she'd never experienced in Boston. Society. These people talked openly about their concerns, shared practical advice, and treated her not as an outsider to be politely tolerated, but as a new member of their community deserving of support and protection. Sarah, Mary Lou said over dessert, I hope you'll consider joining our church auxiliary. We meet every second Sunday to plan community events and coordinate help for families in need. It's a good way to get to know the other women in the valley. I'd like that very much, Sarah replied, meaning it sincerely. The idea of belonging to a community where her contributions mattered was appealing after years of Boston social gatherings that seemed designed primarily for display rather than purpose. And if you're interested in teaching, Doc Williams added, we've been trying to establish a proper school in Millfield for years. Most of the children only get sporadic education when traveling teachers pass through. Someone with your background could make a real difference. Sarah's face lit up with genuine excitement. I would love to teach. I have experience tutoring younger children, and I've always believed education should be available to everyone, not just the wealthy. James watched his new wife's animated discussion of educational philosophy with growing admiration. In Boston, her intelligence and strong opinions had probably been seen as liabilities in a potential bride. Here, they were recognized as valuable assets that could benefit the entire community. The celebration continued into the evening, with Pete regaling them with stories of the valley's early days and Mary Lou sharing gossip from town that was both entertaining and informative. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Sarah felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in years. Eventually, their guests prepared to depart, wanting to reach town before full darkness made the trail treacherous. Mary Lou embraced Sarah once more, whispering practical advice about mountain living and marriage that made the younger woman blush. Pete shook hands with both newlyweds and promised to keep an ear open for any trouble brewing in Sullivan's direction. Doc Williams lingered after the others had gone, his expression serious as he watched their distant figures disappear into the gathering dusk. James, he said quietly, I need to tell you something that couldn't wait for a more private moment. Sullivan's been asking questions about Sarah's background, sending telegrams to contacts in Denver and beyond. James felt his jaw tighten. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest he's looking for leverage. Information about her family, her financial situation, anything that might be used to cause trouble. Doc Williams turned to include Sarah in the conversation. I don't know what he might find, but you should both be prepared for him to use whatever he discovers. Sarah's hand found James's arm, gripping it tightly as she considered the implications. Her father's debts, the men who'd been pressuring her in Boston, the circumstances that had driven her to accept a mail-order marriage arrangement. All of it could be twisted to serve Sullivan's purposes. There are things in my past that could be misrepresented, she said carefully. Nothing criminal or immoral, but circumstances that might sound scandalous if presented in the wrong light. Then we'll face whatever comes together, James said firmly. Legal marriage gives you protection under territorial law, and I'll be damned if I let Sullivan or anyone else use your past to hurt you. Doc Williams nodded approvingly. That's the right attitude. But you should also know that Sullivan's influence extends beyond the local level. He has connections with territorial officials, railroad executives, even some federal authorities. If he decides to make serious trouble, it won't just be a local matter. After the doctor departed, James and Sarah found themselves alone together, for the first time as husband and wife. The cabin seemed quieter somehow, more intimate, despite being the same space where they'd shared breakfast that morning. The reality of their changed relationship hung between them, unspoken but palpable. I should probably mention, James said, breaking the awkward silence, that I'll be sleeping in the barn tonight. I know this marriage is primarily for practical reasons, and I don't want you to feel pressured about expectations. Sarah felt a complex mix of relief and something that might have been disappointment. That's very considerate, she said quietly. Though I hope you don't plan to make the barn your permanent residence. People will talk if they think we're not truly married. We'll figure it out as we go, James replied. I want you to feel comfortable here, safe here. Everything else can develop naturally, if it develops at all. His respect for her comfort and autonomy was both touching and frustrating. Sarah had grown accustomed to men who saw marriage as granting them immediate and complete access to their wives, regardless of the women's feelings. James's restraint was admirable, but it also left her uncertain about where she stood in this new relationship. James, she said carefully, when you wrote about wanting a wife, what exactly did you envision? A business partnership? A companionate marriage? Something more traditional? James considered the question seriously, studying her face in the lamplight. Honestly, I hoped for friendship first, then trust, then perhaps something deeper if we prove compatible. I've seen too many marriages based on passion alone crumble when the passion fades. But I've also seen partnerships without affection become bitter and cold. He paused, then added with characteristic honesty, what I didn't expect was to feel such immediate connection. That complicates things. Sarah felt her heartbeat quicken at his admission. How does it complicate things? Because it makes me want more than I have any right to expect, James said quietly. You married me for protection and security, not because you had feelings for me. It wouldn't be fair to pressure you towards something you might not want. Sarah moved closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. What if I told you that I feel the connection to? That this arrangement has become something more than practical necessity. James's breath caught, and for a moment they stood frozen, balanced on the edge of something that could change everything between them. Then, slowly, he reached up to cup her face in his calloused hands. Then I'd say we're both lucky, he whispered, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart race. When they separated, both were breathing unsteadily. Sarah rested her forehead against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat through his shirt. I think, she said softly, that the barn might be unnecessarily uncomfortable for a man on his wedding night. James's arms tightened around her, and she could hear the smile in his voice when he replied, I was hoping you might say that. The night that followed was a revelation for both of them. Sarah had expected duty and endurance based on the whispered warnings of married women in Boston society. Instead, she found tenderness, patience, and a passion that seemed to grow from genuine affection rather than mere physical desire. James had feared that his rough exterior and simple lifestyle would disappoint a woman accustomed to refinement. Instead, he discovered that authenticity was more attractive than sophistication, that honest emotion was more valuable than polished manners. When dawn broke over Pine Ridge Valley the next morning, it illuminated two people who had found something neither had dared to hope for when they'd entered into their practical arrangement. They were no longer just James Carter and Sarah Mitchell, thrown together by circumstance and convenience. They were partners, allies, and the beginning of something that might, with time and care, become the kind of love that could withstand any challenge. But as the morning light touched the distant peaks, it also illuminated riders approaching from the direction of Millfield. Frank Sullivan was returning, and this time he'd brought more men. The honeymoon period of their marriage was about to face its first serious test. James stood at the window, counting the approaching figures while Sarah dressed quietly behind him. 8 men, he said grimly. Sullivan's not playing games anymore. Sarah joined him at the window, her hand finding his shoulder as she took in the size of the approaching force. What do you think he wants? Same thing he's always wanted, James replied, checking his rifle to ensure it was loaded. My land, my water rights, and now the elimination of any witnesses who might testify to his methods. Then we'll face him together, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. As husband and wife, as partners. James turned to look at her, seeing determination in her eyes that matched his own. Whatever else this marriage had become, it had already proved itself in the most important way possible. They were stronger together than either had been alone, and that strength would be tested in the hours to come. Sullivan's men spread out across the meadow with military precision, their rifles gleaming in the morning sun as they took positions that would cut off any escape routes from the Carter Ranch. Frank Sullivan himself rode straight toward the cabin, his expensive coat billowing. Behind him, like a dark banner of conquest. Behind him came Sheriff Morrison, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the escalating situation, and 6 hired guns whose hard faces spoke of violence as a profession rather than necessity. James stepped onto the porch with his rifle in hand. Sarah beside him carrying the shotgun she'd found in the kitchen. Neither spoke as they watched the approaching force, but their proximity conveyed solidarity that needed no words. Whatever happened next, they would face it as partners. Carter, Sullivan's voice carried across the yard with arrogant authority. Time for our final conversation. Send the woman out here so we can discuss this properly. My wife stays where she is, James called back, emphasizing the word that established Sarah's legal status and his right to protect her. You want to talk? You can do it from where you are. Sullivan's face darkened at the mention of marriage, clearly not having expected this development. He dismounted and strode closer to the porch, his hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture designed to intimidate. Wife? That's convenient timing, Carter. Yesterday, she was a missing passenger. Today, she's your bride. Territorial authorities might find that sequence of events very interesting. Territorial authorities might also find it interesting that you're trespassing on private property with an armed force, Sarah interjected, her voice carrying the cultured authority of her Boston education. I don't believe Colorado law permits private armies to intimidate law-abiding citizens. Sullivan's eyes shifted to her with calculating interest. The famous Sarah Mitchell speaks. Or should I say Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, daughter of the late Charles Mitchell of Boston, Massachusetts? The same Charles Mitchell who died owing substantial sums to some very dangerous men? Sarah felt ice form in her stomach, but she kept her expression neutral. My father's business affairs have nothing to do with my life here. Don't they? Sullivan smiled coldly. Because I've been receiving some very interesting telegrams from Boston. It seems those dangerous men are still looking for ways to collect what they're owed. They'd be very grateful to anyone who could provide information about the whereabouts of Charles Mitchell's only heir. The threat was subtle but clear. Sullivan had enough information about Sarah's past to cause serious trouble, and he was prepared to use it as leverage against both her and James. But before either could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the tense standoff. Doc Williams appeared on the trail, but he wasn't alone. Behind him rode Mary Lou Jenkins, Pete McCormick, and a dozen other Valley residents, all armed and all wearing expressions of grim determination. The morning air suddenly crackled with the tension of 2 opposing forces facing each other across James's meadow. Morning, Frank. Doc Williams called out with deceptive casualness as he positioned his horse between Sullivan's men and the cabin. Seems like quite a gathering you've got here. Almost like you're planning some kind of trouble. Sullivan's confident demeanor faltered slightly as he realized his numerical advantage had evaporated. The Valley residents who had rallied to support James and Sarah might not be professional gunmen, but they were experienced hunters and Indian fighters who knew how to handle weapons in dangerous situations. This is a private matter, Williams, Sullivan said, his voice carrying less authority than before. No concern of yours. Funny thing about Valley communities, Pete McCormick spoke up from his position flanking Sullivan's left side. We tend to consider an attack on one family an attack on all of us. James and Sarah are our neighbors now, which makes this very much our concern. Mary Lou Jenkins had positioned herself with a clear view of Sheriff Morrison, her rifle held with the casual competence of someone who defended her saloon against troublemakers for decades. Sheriff, she called out, I'm curious about the legal authority for this little expedition. Last I checked, territorial law required warrants for armed searches of private property. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly recognizing that his position had become untenable. He'd agreed to support Sullivan's business interests, but facing down an armed group of respected community members was beyond what he'd bargained for. There's been a report of a missing person, Morrison said weakly. We're conducting an investigation. Missing persons been found. Doc Williams replied matter-of-factly. I personally witnessed her marriage to James Carter yesterday evening. Legal ceremony, proper documentation, community witnesses. Nothing missing about her at all. Sullivan's face flushed with anger as he realized his carefully planned intimidation had backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating James and Sarah, his aggressive tactics had unified the entire valley against him. But men like Sullivan didn't reach their positions by backing down when faced with opposition. Very touching, Sullivan said with venomous sarcasm. A whole community rallying to protect their neighbors. But you're all making a serious mistake. I have connections beyond this backward valley, authority that supersedes your local loyalties. As if summoned by his words, another group of riders appeared on the horizon. But these weren't more of Sullivan's hired guns. The lead rider wore the blue uniform of a territorial marshal, and behind him came what appeared to be federal investigators. Sullivan's expression shifted from anger to something approaching panic as he recognized that his threats about territorial authority were about to be put to a very different test than he'd intended. Marshal Thomas Bradley was a man whose reputation preceded him throughout Colorado territory. Honest, competent, and utterly incorruptible, he represented everything that men like Sullivan feared most in territorial law enforcement. His weathered face showed no emotion as he surveyed the armed standoff in James's meadow. Frank Sullivan, Marshal Bradley said with quiet authority that cut through the morning air like a blade. You're under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, and violation of territorial statutes regarding private armies. Sullivan's face went white. Marshal Bradley, there's been some misunderstanding. I'm conducting legitimate business here. No misunderstanding, Bradley replied, dismounting with deliberate calm. We've been investigating your operations for months, Mr. Sullivan. Witness testimony, financial records, documentation of threats, and intimidation. Yesterday's events simply provided the final evidence we needed. One of the federal investigators stepped forward, producing an official-looking document. Mr. Sullivan, I'm Agent Harrison with the Department of the Interior. You're also facing federal charges related to illegal attempts to acquire water rights through fraud and intimidation. The railroad development you've been promising your investors? The federal government never approved any depot construction in this location. The revelation hit Sullivan like a physical blow. His entire scheme had been built on promises he couldn't keep, using threats and violence to acquire land for a railroad facility that was never going to be built. The investors he'd defrauded, the families he'd terrorized, the community he'd tried to dominate. All of it had been for nothing. Sarah watched Sullivan's collapse with a mixture of satisfaction and pity. She'd seen similar men in Boston, businessmen whose greed and arrogance eventually led to their downfall. But she'd also learned that such men rarely went down without trying to inflict as much damage as possible. You think this is over? Sullivan snarled, his mask of civilized authority finally slipping completely. I still have friends, connections. That Boston business isn't going away, Mrs. Carter. Those men will find you eventually, and when they do, actually, Agent Harrison interrupted, consulting another document. That matter has already been resolved. The Department of Justice has been investigating the criminal organization that was pressuring Miss Mitchell and other heirs to fraudulent debts. The ringleaders were arrested in Boston 3 weeks ago. Any claims against the Mitchell estate have been determined to be fabricated. Sarah felt her knees weaken with relief. The shadow that had driven her from Boston, the fear that had shaped her desperate decision to seek marriage with a stranger, was finally gone. She was truly free for the first time since her father's death. James's arm came around her waist, steadying her as the full implications sank in. She no longer needed his protection from Boston creditors, no longer had to hide in the mountains to escape her past. She was free to choose her own future, and the choice she made next would determine everything. Marshal Bradley. Sullivan made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. I demand that you investigate the circumstances of this woman's arrival here. The stagecoach crash, the convenient marriage, the timing of already been investigated, Marshal Bradley said with the tone of a man who'd dealt with too many Frank Sullivans in his career. Stage company confirmed mechanical failure, no foul play. Dr. Williams provided testimony about the marriage ceremony. Every aspect of this situation is completely legal and proper. As Sullivan was led away in shackles, his hired guns surrendering their weapons to federal agents. The tension that had gripped Pine Ridge Valley for months finally began to dissolve. The community members who had rallied to support James and Sarah began to relax, some even laughing with relief as they realized the threat to their peaceful lives was finally over. Sheriff Morrison, looking ashamed and defeated, approached Marshal Bradley with his badge in his hand. "Marshal, I need to resign my position. I let Sullivan influence my judgment, compromised my oath. The people of this county deserve better." Bradley accepted the badge without comment, then turned to address the assembled crowd. "Folks, you'll need to elect a new sheriff. I'd recommend someone with integrity, someone who puts community welfare above personal gain. I nominate James Carter." Pete McCormick called out immediately. Man's got the respect of the entire valley, proven himself under pressure. A chorus of agreement rose from the crowd, but James held up his hand for silence. "I appreciate the confidence, but I'm not the right man for that job. I'm a rancher, not a lawman." He glanced at Doc Williams. "But I know someone who'd serve this community with honor and wisdom." Within an hour, Henry Williams had been unanimously chosen as interim sheriff, with plans for a formal election once word could spread throughout the county. The federal agents departed with their prisoners, taking with them the corruption that had poisoned the valley's peace for too long. As the crowd dispersed, James and Sarah found themselves alone on their porch once again, but everything had changed. The external threats that had forced their hasty marriage were gone. The practical necessities that had brought them together no longer applied. They were free to choose their future without coercion or desperation driving their decisions. "Well," Sarah said quietly, watching the last of the riders disappear toward town, "I suppose this changes things between us." James turned to study her face, seeing something in her expression that he couldn't quite read. "How so?" "When I married you yesterday, I needed your protection, your name, your legal status as my husband. Now I don't need any of those things. The debts are resolved. The threats are gone. I'm free to go wherever I want and do whatever I choose." James felt his heart sink, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. "That's true. You have choices now that you didn't have before." Sarah stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough to notice the slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "The question is, what do I choose?" "What do you want to choose?" James asked, hardly daring to hope. "I want to choose the man who treated a desperate stranger with kindness when he had no obligation to help. I want to choose the community that rallied to protect people they barely knew because it was the right thing to do. I want to choose the life where I can teach children, contribute to something meaningful, be valued for who I am rather than who my father was or how much money I might inherit." She reached up to cup his face in her hands, just as he had done the night before when they'd first kissed as husband and wife. "Most of all, I want to choose love that grew from friendship and respect rather than desperation and convenience." James's arms came around her, pulling her close as relief and joy flooded through him. "Are you sure? Mountain life is hard, Sarah. Isolation, harsh winters, constant work just to survive. It's nothing like the comfort and culture you knew in Boston." "Boston comfort came with a price I was never willing to pay," Sarah replied firmly. "Social expectations that demanded I diminish myself, relationships based on financial advantage, rather than genuine affection, a life where appearance mattered more than substance." She looked out over the valley that had become her home, taking in the mountains and meadows that represented not just beauty but challenge and possibility. "This life offers something Boston never could, the chance to be truly myself, too. Build something lasting with someone I love." "And teaching?" James asked. "The school Doc Williams mentioned?" Sarah's face lit up with enthusiasm. "Already planned. Mary Lou and I discussed it while you men were posturing with rifles. We're going to establish a proper schoolhouse in Millfield with a curriculum that serves children from all the valley families. Pete McCormick has offered to donate lumber, and several families have pledged support." James shook his head in amazement. "You've been here 2 days, and you're already organizing the community." "That's what partners do," Sarah replied with a grin. "They complement each other's strengths. You know ranching, I know education. Together we can contribute more than either of us could alone." As the sun reached its zenith over Pine Ridge Valley, James and Sarah Carter stood on their porch as a truly married couple for the first time. not bound together by legal convenience or practical necessity, but by choice, by love, and by shared commitment to building something meaningful together. The ranch that had felt empty and quiet now hummed with possibility. There would be children's voices in the valley when the school opened, community gatherings in their meadow, perhaps even the sound of their own children playing in the cabin that had once known only solitude. "You know," James said, pulling Sarah closer as they watched clouds cast moving shadows across the mountains. "I wrote in those first letters that this ranch was too quiet without a woman's voice. I thought I just meant conversation, companionship. What do you think now?" Sarah asked. "Now I know I meant something much deeper. I meant the voice of someone who could help me hear possibilities I'd never imagined, who could turn a house into a home and a piece of land into a community." Sarah leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the solid strength that had attracted her from their first meeting, but understanding now that his true strength lay not in his physical capabilities, but in his character, his integrity, his capacity for both tenderness and determination. "The stagecoach crash was the best thing that ever happened to me," she said softly. "How can you say that? You could have been killed." "But I wasn't. Instead, I was led to exactly where I belonged, to exactly the person I was meant to find. Sometimes what looks like disaster is really just life pushing us towards something better than we ever dared to hope for." James tightened his arms around his wife, marveling at the truth of her words. A year ago, he'd been a lonely man writing desperate letters to a woman he'd never met, hoping to fill the silence of his mountain home with mere companionship. Now he held in his arms not just a wife, but a true partner, a woman whose strength and intelligence challenged him to be better than he'd ever imagined possible. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and possibility across the valley where two people had found each other across the wreckage of their separate pasts and built something beautiful from the fragments. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of promise, shaped by the daily choice to stand together against whatever challenges might come. In the distance, the church bell in Millfield began to ring, calling the community to Sunday services where families would gather to give thanks for blessings received and prayers answered. Soon, James and Sarah would join them, taking their place among neighbors who had become friends, contributing their voices to hymns of gratitude that would echo across the mountains. The mountain man who had thought his ranch too quiet without a woman's voice had discovered something far more precious than conversation. He had found harmony, the perfect blending of two lives into something greater than either could achieve alone. And the lost bride who had stumbled through darkness toward an unknown future had found not just safety, but home. Their story would become legend in Pine Ridge Valley, told and retold around winter fires and summer gatherings, a reminder that love often arrives in the most unexpected ways, that courage can triumph over corruption, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simple decision to trust a stranger who offers kindness when kindness is desperately needed. 6 months after Sullivan's arrest, the sound of children's laughter echoed across Pine Ridge Valley for the first time in decades. The one-room schoolhouse that Sarah had envisioned during those first dangerous days at the Carter Ranch now stood proud and solid on a hill overlooking Millfield, its bell tower visible from every homestead in the valley. Inside, 23 children of all ages bent over their slates, learning to read words that would open worlds beyond the mountain peaks that ringed their home. Sarah moved between the rows of rough-hewn desks, her hand resting gently on young shoulders as she helped sound out difficult words or explained arithmetic problems. The children ranged from 6-year-old Emma Rodriguez, whose bright eyes sparkled with curiosity about everything from butterflies to distant cities, to 16-year-old Michael Sullivan, Frank Sullivan's nephew who had chosen to stay in the valley despite his uncle's disgrace. "Mrs. Carter," Emma piped up during the geography lesson, her small finger tracing the outline of Colorado Territory on the wall map. "Have you really been to all these places back east?" Sarah smiled, remembering the frightened woman who had stumbled through mountain darkness just months before. That desperate flight from Boston now seemed like something that had happened to someone else entirely. "I lived in Boston, which is right here," she said, pointing to the distant coast. "And I traveled through many states on my way to Colorado. But you know what I discovered?" The children leaned forward eagerly, hungry for stories about the wider world beyond their mountain home. Even Michael, who often affected teenage indifference to learning, looked up from his book with interest. I discovered that the most beautiful place in the world was right here, waiting for me to find it, Sarah continued. Sometimes the best adventures begin when we stop running from one place to another and start building something meaningful where we are. Through the schoolhouse window, she could see James working with Pete McCormick and several other ranchers to repair the bridge over Silver Creek. The spring thaw had damaged the wooden structure, and the men had volunteered their labor to ensure safe passage for families bringing their children to school. James looked up from his work and caught her eye, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that still made her heart flutter. Their marriage had deepened in ways neither had expected. During those first desperate days, what began as mutual protection had grown into genuine partnership, the kind of love that was tested and strengthened by shared challenges rather than weakened by them. James had proven to be not just a capable rancher and protective husband, but a thoughtful companion who encouraged her ambitions and supported her dreams. Mrs. Carter, 12-year-old Thomas Walsh, raised his hand hesitantly. "My pa says you're going to have a baby come winter. Is that true?" Sarah felt warmth flood her cheeks as 23 pairs of eyes fixed on her with intense curiosity. The news wasn't exactly secret. In a community as small as theirs, little remained private for long, but she hadn't expected to discuss it during a geography lesson. "It's true," she said gently, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. "Your mothers will tell you that babies are blessings that bring families great joy." "Will the baby come to school too?" Emma asked with the serious concern of a 6-year-old trying to understand adult mysteries. "Someday," Sarah laughed. "But first the baby has to grow big enough to walk and talk and hold a pencil." The afternoon lessons continued with renewed energy, the children excited by the prospect of a new baby in their community. Sarah found herself grateful for their innocent enthusiasm, which made the changes in her body feel like community celebration rather than private worry. In Boston, pregnancy was often treated as an unfortunate necessity endured in relative isolation. Here, it was welcomed as a gift that would strengthen the bonds holding their small society together. When school dismissed for the day, Sarah remained behind to prepare lessons for the following week. She was grading arithmetic papers when she heard familiar footsteps on the schoolhouse porch. James appeared in the doorway, his work clothes dusty but his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a productive day. "How are my two favorite teachers?" he asked, settling into one of the adult-sized chairs he'd built specifically for parent conferences. "Your son or daughter was very popular today," Sarah replied, showing him Thomas Walsh's question written in careful letters on his slate. "The children are excited about having a baby to spoil." James's expression grew tender as he looked at his wife, still amazed by the transformation from that desperate woman in a torn wedding dress to this confident educator who had become the heart of their community's future. "And how is the baby's mother feeling?" "Strong," Sarah said truthfully. "Dr. Williams says everything is progressing normally, and Mary Lou has appointed herself my personal advisor on all matters related to pregnancy and child rearing." "That's terrifying," James said with mock horror. Mary Lou's advice usually involves whiskey for medicinal purposes. Their laughter was interrupted by the sound of multiple horses approaching the schoolhouse. Through the window, they could see Marshall, Bradley riding up the hill accompanied by Agent Harrison and two men they didn't recognize. Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety despite knowing that Sullivan was safely imprisoned in Denver awaiting trial. Marshal Bradley dismounted with the measured movements of a man who brought serious news, but not necessarily bad news. His face was grave, but not alarmed as he approached the schoolhouse steps. "James, Sarah," he said formally, touching his hat brim in greeting. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but we have some developments to discuss regarding the Sullivan case." James stepped protectively closer to Sarah, his hand finding hers in a gesture that had become instinctive over the months of their marriage. "What kind of developments?" Agent Harrison stepped forward with a folder thick with official documents. "Mr. Sullivan has agreed to cooperate fully with federal authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony has led to arrests of corrupt officials in 3 territories and exposed a network of land fraud that extends far beyond Colorado." "That's good news," Sarah said carefully. "But why bring it to us personally?" "Because Sullivan's Cooperation has also led to the recovery of substantial assets, Marshall Bradley explained. Illegal profits from his various schemes, properties acquired through fraud, funds stolen from legitimate investors. The federal government is required to make restitution to his victims. One of the unknown men stepped forward, introducing himself as Henry Peterson, a federal attorney specializing in asset recovery. Mrs. Carter, our investigation has determined that your father's business dealings with Sullivan's associates were legitimate, but that he was deliberately bankrupted through fraudulent schemes designed to force profitable businesses into debt. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Her father's financial ruin, the debts that had driven her from Boston, the threats that had forced her into a desperate mail-order marriage, all of it had been orchestrated by the same criminal network that Sullivan belonged to. "Are you saying my father was murdered financially?" she asked quietly. "Essentially, yes," Peterson replied with professional compassion. "Your father discovered irregularities in certain business partnerships and threatened to expose them. The response was systematic destruction of his credit, fabrication of debts, and harassment designed to prevent him from pursuing legal remedies." James felt his wife sway slightly and tightened his grip on her hand. The woman who had blamed herself for her family's disgrace was learning that she had been the victim of elaborate criminal conspiracy, not the daughter of a failed businessman. "The good news," Peterson continued, "is that we've recovered approximately $60,000 in assets that rightfully belong to the Mitchell estate. As your father's sole heir, Mrs. Carter, that money is yours." The sum was staggering, more than most mountain ranchers saw in a lifetime of hard work. It represented not just financial security, but vindication for her father's memory and freedom from the shadows that had shaped her adult life. "There's more," Agent Harrison added, consulting his documents. "Sullivan's testimony has also revealed the location of several legitimate business contracts that your father had negotiated before his death. When honored by the courts, these should yield additional income for years to come." Sarah sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. In a single conversation, she had gone from being a refugee from financial ruin to being a woman of independent means, wealthy enough to live anywhere and do anything she chose. "Mrs. Carter," Peterson said gently, "you should understand that this money comes with no restrictions. You're free to relocate to Boston, New York, San Francisco, anywhere you'd prefer to raise your child. Many women in your position choose to return to more civilized society." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah looked around the schoolhouse that she had built with community support and her own determination, then out the window at the valley that had become home in ways Boston never was. Finally, her eyes returned to James, seeing in his weathered face both hope and fear as he waited for her decision. "Agent Harrison," she said slowly, "what exactly happens to recovered assets if the rightful heir chooses not to claim them personally?" Harrison looked surprised by the question. "Well, they can be donated to charitable causes, used to establish foundations, invested for community benefit." "Why do you ask?" Sarah stood, her hand finding James's arm as she moved to the window, overlooking the valley. Below them, children were making their way home along paths that wound between modest cabins and hard-working ranches. These families had welcomed her without question, supported her dreams, and created a community where her child would grow up surrounded by people who valued character over wealth. "Because I want to establish an educational foundation for Pine Ridge Valley," she said firmly. "A fund to ensure that this school continues to operate, that teachers are properly paid, that children who show promise can pursue higher education regardless of their family's financial circumstances." Peterson looked confused. "Mrs. Carter, you're talking about giving away a fortune to live in frontier isolation. Surely you'd prefer to use this money to return to the comfort and culture of Eastern society?" "I tried Eastern society," Sarah replied with quiet conviction. "It taught me to value appearances over substance, to compromise my principles for social acceptance, to measure my worth by others' opinions rather than my own accomplishments." She gestured toward the schoolhouse. "Around them. Here, I've built something meaningful with my own hands and mind. Here, I'm valued for who I am rather than who my father was or how much money I inherited." James felt pride swell in his chest as he listened to his wife articulate the choice that would define their future. She could leave him for a life of luxury and sophistication, but she was choosing instead to invest in the community that had given her the chance to become her best self. Besides, Sarah continued with a smile that lit up the room, I've already found the greatest treasure Colorado has to offer. Money can't buy what James and I have built together. Marshall Bradley cleared his throat, drawing their attention. Back to official business. There is one more matter we need to discuss. The territorial government has decided to establish Pine Ridge Valley as an official township, with its own local government and law enforcement. Dr. Williams has done an excellent job as interim sheriff, but the position needs to be formally filled. We've already discussed this, James said. I'm not interested in being sheriff. I'm a rancher, not a lawman. Actually, Marshall Bradley continued, we're not offering you the sheriff position. We're offering you the position of territorial representative for the new township. Someone to coordinate with territorial authorities, oversee local development, ensure that the interests of small communities are represented in territorial decisions. The position would provide steady income while allowing James to remain on his ranch and continue the work he loved. More importantly, it would give him influence to protect the valley from future threats like Sullivan's schemes. It would mean travel occasionally, Marshall Bradley added, meetings in Denver, coordination with other community representatives. But the base of operations would be here in Pine Ridge Valley. Sarah squeezed James's hand encouragingly. It sounds perfect. A way to serve the community while staying true to who you are. Agent Harrison gathered his documents with the efficient movements of a man accustomed to delivering life-changing news. We'll need formal responses to these offers within a week. Mrs. Carter, the federal attorney's office will handle all the legal arrangements for your father's estate and the educational foundation. Mr. Carter, territorial authorities will want an answer about the representative position by month's end. After the officials departed, James and Sarah found themselves alone in the schoolhouse as evening shadows lengthened across the valley. The magnitude of the day's revelations created a strange intimacy between them, the shared knowledge that their lives had just changed in ways they were still trying to understand. $60,000, James said wonderingly. That's enough to buy half the valley, or to ensure that children in this valley have educational opportunities for generations to come, Sarah replied. Money that was stolen through greed and corruption, transformed into something that builds rather than destroys. James pulled his wife close, marveling at the woman who had stumbled onto his porch 6 months ago carrying nothing but determination and hope. Are you certain about this choice? You could live like a queen in Boston with that kind of money. I was miserable as a princess in Boston, Sarah said firmly. Here, I'm happy as a teacher, a wife, a future mother, a member of a community that values what I can contribute rather than what I can afford to buy. Through the schoolhouse windows, they could see lights beginning to appear in cabin windows. Throughout the valley as families gathered for evening meals. Somewhere among those lights, their own cabin waited with its warm hearth and comfortable simplicity, a place where they had built love from trust and partnership from mutual respect. James, Sarah said softly, do you remember what you wrote in your first letter? About how your ranch was too quiet without a woman's voice. I remember thinking I just wanted conversation, someone to talk to during long winter evenings. Sarah smiled, her hand moving to rest on her growing belly, where their child was beginning to make its presence known. And now? Now I know it wasn't conversation I was missing, James replied, understanding filling his voice. It was harmony, the sound of a life being lived fully, of dreams being built into reality, of love creating something bigger than either of us could achieve alone. As they locked up the schoolhouse and began the walk home through gathering dusk, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The stagecoach crash that had seemed like disaster had been the beginning of the best chapter of her life. The desperate flight from Boston had led her to exactly where she belonged. The fears and uncertainties that had driven her into a marriage with a stranger had transformed into the deepest love she had ever experienced. You know, she said, taking James's work-roughened hand in hers, I used to think that happiness meant safety, security, having enough money to insulate myself from life's uncertainties. What do you think now? Now I think happiness means partnership with someone who makes you braver than you thought possible, community with people who see your best self even when you can't see it yourself, and the courage to build something meaningful even when the future is uncertain. Their cabin appeared ahead of them, lamplight glowing warmly in the windows that Mary Lou had helped Sarah hang with curtains made from fabric ordered all the way from Denver. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth James had built with his own hands, and the kitchen table held preparations for the evening meal they would share as husband and wife, partners in every sense of the word. The mountains that ringed Pine Ridge Valley stood sentinel in the gathering darkness, their peaks touched with starlight and promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but James and Sarah Carter would face them together, their love strengthened by every trial they had already overcome. In the distance, the church bell in Millfield chimed the hour, its bronze voice carrying across the valley like a benediction. Soon, that bell would ring for the baptism of their child. Another voice added to the harmony of a community that had learned the value of standing together against whatever storms might come. The mountain man who had thought his ranch too quiet without a woman's voice had discovered that the right voice could transform not just a home, but an entire valley. And the lost bride who had stumbled through darkness toward an uncertain future had found that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with elaborate plans, but with the simple courage to trust and love when love offers itself honestly. Their story would be remembered in Pine Ridge Valley long after both of them had passed into legend, a reminder that the best marriages are partnerships that make both people stronger, that true wealth is measured in the lives we touch rather than the money we accumulate, and that love, once planted in good soil and tended with care, grows deeper roots than any storm can shake. The first snowfall of winter arrived early that year, blanketing Pine Ridge Valley in pristine white that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and new. Sarah stood at the kitchen window of the Carter Ranch, one hand pressed against the glass while the other rested on her rounded belly where their child moved restlessly, as if sensing the approaching storm that would herald its birth. The contractions had begun during the pre-dawn hours, gentle at first like the tentative touch of snowflakes against the window, but steadily growing stronger as the morning progressed. Sarah had learned enough about frontier childbirth from Mary Lou and the other valley women to recognize the signs, but experiencing them herself was entirely different from academic knowledge. James moved around the kitchen with the focused efficiency of a man who had prepared for this day for months, stoking the fire to ensure adequate warmth, boiling water according to Dr. Williams's detailed instructions, and arranging the clean linens that Mary Lou had insisted were essential for a safe delivery. His hands were steady as he worked, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept returning to her face to assess her condition. "The roads will be impassable soon," Sarah observed, watching the snow fall with increasing intensity. "Are you certain Dr. Williams can make it through?" "Henry's delivered babies in worse conditions than this," James replied with more confidence than he felt. "Besides, Mary Lou left her ranch before dawn. She'll be here regardless of weather, and she's assisted at more births than any doctor." In the territory, as if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses cut through the winter silence. Mary Lou Jenkins appeared through the swirling snow like a frontier angel of mercy, her sturdy mare navigating the treacherous trail with the sure-footed confidence of an animal accustomed to mountain weather. Behind her rode Dr. Williams, his medical bag secured against the elements, his weathered face set with the determination of a man who had never missed a birth in 30 years of frontier practice. "How are we doing, dear?" Mary Lou called out as she dismounted, her arms laden with supplies that included everything from additional linens to a bottle of whiskey that served multiple medicinal purposes in frontier obstetrics. "Better now that you're here," Sarah admitted, feeling relief wash over her as the two most experienced birth attendants in the valley took charge of the situation with practiced competence. Dr. Williams examined Sarah with the gentle professionalism that had earned him the trust of every family in Pine Ridge Valley, his experienced hands assessing the progress of labor, while his calm demeanor reassured both parents that everything was proceeding normally. "First babies often take their time," he announced after completing his examination. "We're looking at several more hours, but everything appears to be progressing exactly as it should. James, you might want to take care of the animals now, while you have time." James hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave Sarah's side even for the necessary chores that kept a ranch functioning. "Go," Sarah encouraged him with a smile that was interrupted by another contraction. The cattle won't feed themselves, and I have excellent care here. The next few hours passed in a rhythm of increasing intensity, punctuated by moments of quiet preparation. Mary Lou regaled Sarah with stories of other births she had attended, including several dramatic deliveries during blizzards, Indian raids, and various frontier emergencies that put their current situation into perspective. Your mother-in-law would have loved this weather, Mary Lou commented during one of the quieter moments, adjusting the pillows behind Sarah's back with the practiced efficiency of someone who had attended dozens of births. James's mother used to say that babies born during the first snow of winter were blessed with special strength for surviving mountain life. James rarely mentions his parents, Sarah said, grateful for any distraction from the increasing discomfort. I know they died when he was young, but he doesn't talk about those early years. Lost them both to fever when he was 14, Mary Lou explained sadly. Harsh winter, isolated ranch, no doctor within 100 miles. James survived alone for 2 years before Pete McCormick found him and helped him rebuild. That boy learned self-reliance the hard way, which is probably why he values community so much now. The revelation helped Sarah understand her husband's fierce protectiveness and his deep appreciation for the support network they had built in Pine Ridge Valley. James had experienced the devastating loneliness of mountain isolation, which made their current abundance of caring friends and neighbors even more precious. As afternoon shifted toward evening, the contractions intensified beyond anything Sarah had experienced. Dr. Williams moved between encouraging reassurance and careful monitoring, his professional calm masking the vigilance required for frontier childbirth where the nearest hospital was 3 days' ride through mountain passes. Everything is progressing beautifully, he assured Sarah during one of the more difficult moments. Your child is strong and eager to meet the world. Just remember to breathe through each contraction and trust your body to do what it was designed to do. James paced the main room of the cabin like a caged mountain cat, unable to settle despite the stack of ranch paperwork that demanded his attention. The sound of Sarah's labored breathing reached him through the bedroom door, each gasp a reminder of his complete helplessness in this most important moment of their lives together. First-time fathers always pace, Pete McCormick observed from his position by the fireplace where he had settled to wait out the birth and provide moral support. I wore a groove in my cabin floor when my first boy was born. Of course, that was 40 years ago, and the boy grew up to be a fine man despite my worrying. How do you stand it? James asked, pausing in his restless movement to look at the older man. Knowing that everything you care about most in the world is happening in that room, and there's nothing you can do to help. You trust the women, Pete replied simply. Mary Lou's delivered half the children in this valley, and Doc Williams has never lost a mother or baby in all his years of practice. Your job right now is to keep the home fires burning and be ready to welcome your child when it arrives. As darkness fell outside and the snowstorm intensified, the sounds from the bedroom shifted to a new urgency that had both men sitting forward in their chairs. Dr. Williams appeared in the doorway, his sleeves rolled up and his expression focused but optimistic. James, your child is ready to be born, he announced. Would you like to be present for the birth? The invitation was unusual by the standards of the time, when men were typically excluded from the birthing process, but frontier communities often adapted traditional practices to accommodate practical realities. James moved toward the bedroom with the reverent steps of a man approaching something sacred. Sarah lay propped against a mountain of pillows, her hair damp with perspiration, but her eyes bright with determination and anticipation. Mary Lou positioned herself at Sarah's side, ready to provide support and encouragement during the final stages of labor. One more strong push, dear, Dr. Williams instructed, his hands ready to receive the new life that was fighting to enter the world. Your baby is almost here. Sarah gathered every ounce of strength she possessed, her hand gripping James's with surprising force as she pushed with all the power of her love for this child they had created together. James felt tears stream down his weathered cheeks as he witnessed the miracle of birth, the incredible strength of the woman he had married, and the arrival of their son into the world. The baby's first cry pierced the winter night like a declaration of independence, a strong, healthy sound that brought immediate smiles to every face in the room. Dr. Williams worked quickly to ensure the infant's breathing was clear before placing the child in Sarah's waiting arms. A son, he announced with the satisfaction of a job well done. Strong lungs, good color, perfect in every way that matters. James stared at the tiny face nestled against Sarah's chest, overwhelmed by the immediate and complete love he felt for this child, who carried both his name and his hope for the future. The baby's features were still forming, but James could see traces of Sarah's delicate bone structure combined with what might become his own strong jaw. "He's beautiful," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from the exertion of labor, but filled with wonder as she studied their son's face. "Look at his hands, James. He's going to be strong like his father and intelligent like his mother," James replied, his finger gently touching the tiny fist that gripped Sarah's thumb with surprising determination. "What should we call him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but seeing their son's face somehow made the decision clear. "Thomas," Sarah said without hesitation. "Thomas James Carter, after your grandfather and your own middle name." "Thomas James Carter," James repeated, testing the sound of his son's name. "Tommy for short, until he's old enough to demand the dignity of his full name." Mary Lou bustled around the room with the efficient aftermath of successful childbirth, cleaning, and organizing while Dr. Williams completed his examination of both mother and child. The winter storm raged outside, but inside the Carter cabin, warmth and joy created a circle of light that seemed to push back against the darkness. "Sarah handled this like a true mountain woman," Mary Lou announced with approval. "Strong throughout, no complications, and that boy came into the world ready to take on whatever challenges life might bring." Dr. Williams packed his medical supplies with the satisfaction of another successful delivery. "Both mother and child are healthy, which is the best outcome we could hope for. Sarah, you'll need rest for the next few days, but you should recover completely. James, you have a strong son who's going to need guidance growing up in this valley." As their friends prepared to brave the storm for the journey back to their own homes, Sarah and James found themselves alone with their son for the first time. The cabin that had once felt empty despite their love now hummed with the presence of new life, the promise of a future built on the foundation they had created together. "He's so small," James marveled, holding Tommy with the careful reverence of a man who had never been entrusted with anything so precious. "It's hard to believe that something this tiny will grow up to be a man." "Not just any man," Sarah corrected gently. "He'll grow up to be a Carter man, which means he'll be strong enough to survive mountain winters, stubborn enough to stand up for what's right, and kind enough to help strangers who stumble onto his porch in torn wedding dresses." James laughed softly, remembering that night 8 months ago when Sarah had arrived like an answer to prayers he hadn't known he was praying. The desperate woman who had crashed into his life carrying nothing but hope and determination had become the mother of his child, the center of his world, and the heart of a community that grew stronger every day. "Do you think he'll want to stay in the valley when he grows up?" James asked, watching his son's peaceful face in the flickering lamplight. "Or will he be drawn to cities and opportunities we can't provide?" "I think he'll choose whatever makes him happiest," Sarah replied with the wisdom of a woman who had learned the value of following her heart rather than other people's expectations. "Our job is to give him roots strong enough to keep him grounded and wings strong enough to let him fly wherever his dreams take him." The snowstorm continued through the night, but inside the Carter cabin, 3 people slept peacefully in the warmth of love that had been tested by trials and strengthened by shared purpose. Tommy's occasional cries for feeding were answered immediately by parents who had learned that the greatest adventures often begin with the smallest steps. When morning arrived, the storm had passed, leaving Pine Ridge Valley transformed into a winter wonderland that sparkled with fresh possibilities. James stood at the kitchen window holding his son while Sarah recovered her strength, both of them watching the sun rise over mountains that seemed to promise protection and prosperity for the family they had created. "The school will need to close for a few days," Sarah observed, noting the depth of snow that would make travel dangerous for the valley children. "But when it reopens, the students will be excited to meet their teacher's new baby. And in a few years, Tommy will be one of those students," James added, imagining his son learning to read and right in the schoolhouse that Sarah had built with such determination and love. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their quiet morning, and through the window they could see Pete McCormick leading a procession of Valley residents who had braved the post-storm conditions to check on the new family. Mary Lou rode alongside the old rancher, her saddlebags undoubtedly filled with food and supplies for the new mother. "Looks like our son is about to receive his first community welcome," James observed with amusement. Throughout the day, neighbors arrived with gifts, advice, and congratulations for the newest member of Pine Ridge Valley. Each family brought something practical for the baby's care along with stories about their own children and the joys and challenges of raising families in frontier conditions. "This boy will never lack for aunts and uncles," Mary Lou declared, holding Tommy with the experienced hands of a woman who had helped raise half the children in the valley. "He'll grow up knowing that he belongs to a community that will always support him." Dr. Williams arrived in the afternoon for a follow-up examination, pronouncing both mother and child in excellent health. "Tommy's got the lungs of a future cattle rancher and the grip of someone who'll never let go of what matters to him," he announced with professional satisfaction. As evening approached and the last of their visitors departed, Sarah and James found themselves alone with their son in the quiet aftermath of celebration. The cabin felt different now, filled with the presence of new life and the promise of a future that stretched beyond their own dreams and ambitions. "James," Sarah said softly as she nursed Tommy by the firelight, "do you remember what you said about your ranch being too quiet without a woman's voice?" "I remember thinking I just wanted company," James replied, settling beside his wife and son with the contentment of a man whose life had exceeded his wildest dreams. "I had no idea I was really asking for a family." And now, James looked around their home, taking in the evidence of lives well lived and love well shared. The bookshelf Sarah had organized with teaching materials and literature, the rocking chair he had built for nursing their child, the photographs of their wedding and community celebrations that decorated the mantel. Every corner spoke of partnership, purpose, and the kind of happiness that was built day by day through shared commitment and mutual support. "Now I know that silence isn't the absence of sound," he said thoughtfully. "It's the absence of purpose, the absence of love, the absence of someone to share your life with. This ranch will never be quiet again because it's filled with the sound of family." Tommy stirred in Sarah's arms, his tiny face scrunching with the expressions that would become familiar over the years to come. In that moment, both parents could see glimpses of the man he would become, strong like his father, intelligent like his mother, and blessed with the kind of community support that would give him the confidence to face whatever challenges life might bring. Outside, Pine Ridge Valley settled into winter quiet, but it was the peaceful silence of a community at rest rather than the empty silence of isolation. In cabins throughout the valley, families gathered around their own firesides, secure in the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves, connected by bonds of mutual support and shared values. The story that had begun with a desperate woman stumbling through mountain darkness toward an uncertain future had become a legacy of love, community, and hope that would influence generations to come. The school that Sarah had built would educate children who would grow up to be leaders. The partnerships that James had fostered would create prosperity that benefited everyone, and the family they had created together would be living proof that the greatest adventures often begin with the courage to trust and love when love offers itself honestly. Years would pass, and Tommy would grow from infant to child to young man, eventually taking his place as a leader in the community his parents had helped to build. He would marry a valley girl who shared his values and raise children of his own in the shadow of the mountains that had sheltered his family's love story. The Carter Ranch would remain a symbol of what was possible when people chose to build rather than destroy, to include rather than exclude, to love rather than fear. And in the quiet moments of future winters, when snow fell softly on Pine Ridge Valley and families gathered around their fires, the story of James and Sarah Carter would be told and retold, a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come not from careful planning but from the courage to embrace unexpected possibilities, the wisdom to recognize love when it appears in unfamiliar forms, and the strength to build something beautiful from the raw materials of hope and determination. The mountain man who had thought his ranch too quiet without a woman's voice had discovered that the right voice could fill not just a home, but an entire valley with harmony. The lost bride who had stumbled through darkness toward an unknown future had found that sometimes being lost is just another way of being found by exactly the right person at exactly the right time. Their love story had become legend, but more importantly, it had become foundation, the bedrock upon which future generations would build their own dreams of love, community, and the endless possibility that exists when people choose to believe in each other despite every reason not to. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.